Let's go to Brussels now and speak with Rachel Owens, who's the head of EU Advocacy at the Advocacy Group, Global Witness. Thank you so much for speaking with us here on France 24. We had the Panama Papers, and in which it was clear in that case that we were talking about tax dodging, people covering up where their money was being parked. In this particular case, is it tax dodging or is it simply, well, tax avoidance?
So the Paradise Papers show in unprecedented detail the extent to which corporate secrecy is used for money laundering, tax evasion, and corruption in general. My organisation, Global Witness, has been addressing this issue and exposing this issue for over 20 years. And this newest leak has shown in unprecedented detail the extent to which this corporate secrecy exists.
How does it move the story on from what we found out from the Panama Papers?
I think that's a really good question, and one, in fact, the EU needs to answer for. So it's been almost a year and a half since the last huge revelation, the so-called Panama Papers, and the EU hasn't really acted. There's been 7 rounds of negotiations here in Brussels, and there's been a lot of blocking done by the EU governments, particularly big member states like Germany. And this is the reason why we don't actually have a really strong EU response. What we need is the EU to bring in next week's crunch negotiations on the EU anti-money laundering rules. We need them to reveal the real owners of companies and trusts.
The real owners, and of course there's the case of those who are laundering money and those who perhaps have conflicts of interest. Case in point, the Commerce Secretary, who's come out fighting in the United States, Wilbur Ross, who has ties to in-laws of the son-in-law of Vladimir Putin, as well as a close friend of his with one of his business interests. Rachel, let's listen to what Wilbur Ross had to say in his defense.
The company that is our client, Cyborg itself, was not then sanctioned, is not now sanctioned, and never was sanctioned in between. So there's nothing whatsoever improper about Navigator having a relationship with Cyborg. I don't know any of those individuals, have never met them, certainly not had any commercial dealings with them.
Nothing whatsoever improper. Your reaction, Rachel Owens?
Well, I mean, as I said, my organisation, Global Witness, has been exposing and investigating these type of cases for over 20 years, and corruption is not a victimless crime. In one of the most prominent cases that we've investigated in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the poorest countries in the world, over $1.4 billion was lost through corruption and anonymous companies. Now, that's food in people's mouths, and that's healthcare. In fact, actually, that figure is double the health and education budget in that poor country. So I think these kind of cases are going to keep coming out during the week. We're probably going to see more EU politicians and companies named in these leaks. And as I said, enough is enough. It's time for the EU to act. And next week in the negotiations, to bring in really strong transparency rules to tackle anti-money laundering, corruption and tax evasion, and make sure that we get information, public information, on the real owners of companies and trusts.
Yeah, but you heard what Wilbur Ross had to say there, that he'd done nothing wrong, that simply he was working with, as an investor with a company who did business with a third company, and that therefore he can't be held accountable for everything.
I mean, I think it's one case, as I said, and what we're talking about is a systemic issue. So instead of commenting on the specific case, I think actually what's most important here, and what your viewers at home are most interested in, is the number of politicians, the number of criminals involved in these leaks, And actually what we now need is government action, political will to tackle this and to break open the secrecy. You know, it must be the beginning of the end for these tax havens and for these anonymous companies and vehicles, which are used by the rich and the powerful to avoid tax and a whole raft of other different measures. You know, you and me are not able to use these kind of systems because we're not rich and powerful. And I think the viewers at home will understand that there's a difference going on here. And if you're rich and powerful, you're basically able to skirt the system.
Of course, things have changed. I mean, since the Panama Papers, what most recently we saw the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who was forced to resign and who faces criminal charges. That's just one example among many from the Panama Papers. What do you think is going to be the upshot this time around?
I mean, I think heads will roll, to be honest. And I think, you know, this is the case in point why we need this information to be public. You know, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists spent over a year looking at all of these documents, and they only got them because they were leaked to them. So I think the point is that we actually need a lot more transparency, we need a lot more public information, which acts as a deterrent against this kind of corruption and criminal activity. So I definitely think that this week we'll see heads will roll. And as I said, you know, it comes at a very poignant time here in Brussels, a week before this crucial negotiation on the EU anti-money laundering rules, which will happen next Tuesday. And, you know, we really should be calling on our EU governments, including France, to take a stand and really bring in much more transparency.
Rachel Owens, the head of EU Advocacy at Global Witness, so many thanks for speaking with us at France 24.